Let me tell you something quietly unsettling about people who reinvent themselves completely. They shed entire versions of themselves, like dead skin. The corporate lawyer becomes a surf instructor. The ambitious climber walks away from everything they built to start over. You might know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. And if you are, maybe you've wondered, am I broken? Am I running from something? Or is there something else happening beneath the surface? Here's the question that always lingers. Why? Why would someone abandon everything they built when most people are too terrified to even pivot? And more importantly, what if reinvention isn't instability at all, but something far more profound? It's easy to assume people who reinvent themselves are lost, running from something, or afraid of commitment. That they're chasing novelty because they can't handle depth, that they lack the maturity to stick with anything long enough to see it through. But that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there's an entire psychology at play, one that speaks volumes about self-awareness, courage, and the refusal to calcify into a version of yourself that stopped fitting months or years ago. See, for some people, reinvention isn't confusion, it's clarity in motion. It's the courage to kill what others loved about you because you recognize it isn't true anymore. The willingness to disappoint people who preferred the old version because staying would mean performing a self that died somewhere along the way. Because whether we admit it or not, modern culture has created an unspoken rule. You owe people consistency. You owe them the version they met. You owe a self that makes sense to everyone who knew you before. It rewards stability. It praises those who know themselves and never deviate. And yet, those who shed their identities repeatedly are often the ones who understand themselves most clearly. They recognize when something no longer fits. They honor the truth of their evolution instead of performing continuity for an audience that wants them to stay recognizable. Psychologists have found something fascinating. People who reinvent themselves tend to score higher on traits like openness to experience, internal locus of identity, and what researchers call self-authorship. The ability to define yourself from the inside rather than accepting the definitions others place on you. In other words, they aren't lost. They're refusing to stay found in a place that no longer holds them. And in a world obsessed with personal brands and consistent narratives, that's radical. Because let's be honest, most people aren't living their identity. They're maintaining it, defending it, performing it for an audience that expects them to stay the same. Every LinkedIn update, every carefully curated story about their journey says, "This is who I am. Do you recognize me? Do you approve?" But when you reinvent yourself completely, something shifts. You stop defending your evolution. You start trusting that who you're becoming matters more than who people remember you being. They just can't find themselves in performed consistency anymore. For some, the decision to reinvent comes after a kind of identity exhaustion. Maybe they spent years building a self that looked impressive on paper, the right career, the right lifestyle, the right image, until one day, the gap between who they were and who they appeared to be became unbearable. They realized that every time they introduced themselves, they felt a subtle dishonesty. Not because they were lying, but because the truth of who they were had outgrown the story they were telling. They weren't that person anymore. They were defending a ghost. So they stopped. No announcement, just a slow unraveling of everything that once defined them. And then a rebuilding, sometimes in a completely different direction. Sometimes in the same field, but with an entirely different energy. But here's what's often misunderstood about people who reinvent themselves. The change isn't random. It's not chaos for chaos's sake. There's a pattern beneath the pattern. Each transformation is usually moving towards something, not just away from something. A deeper alignment, a truer frequency, a version of themselves they sensed but couldn't access while performing the old identity. Think about it like this. Some people are built for lifelong consistency. Their core self emerges early and stays relatively stable. They're lucky. They found their frequency and get to live it for decades. But others, they're built differently. They have multiple frequencies inside them, multiple lives they need to live within one lifetime. And staying in one identity too long feels like suffocation. Not because they're flighty or uncommitted, but because their internal evolution outpaces society's expectation for continuity. There's a concept in psychology called identity fluidity. The understanding that self isn't fixed, that who you are at 25 might be unrecognizable to who you are at 40. And for some people, that fluidity isn't a flaw. It's their design When relationships or careers become heavy, when the old identity feels like a costume they're tired of wearing, they don't fight it. They don't try to force themselves back into what worked before. They let it go. They rebuild. And that's where the loneliness enters. Because when you reinvent yourself, you lose people. Not because they're bad people, but because they knew a version of you that no longer exists. They loved the corporate climber. They admired the party animal. They built their relationship with someone you used to be. And when that person dies, when you show up as someone new, some people can't make the leap. They resist. They mourn. They accuse you of changing, as if change were betrayal. That's the cost nobody talks about. Every reinvention requires killing parts of yourself others still recognize. It's lonely. People resist your transformation because it threatens the story they told themselves about you. So people who transform repeatedly often become experts at solitude. Not because they want to be alone, but because they've learned that not everyone can hold space for the version of you that's emerging. That sometimes love means letting people go who only knew the old you. And maybe that's not coldness or detachment. Maybe it's just honoring the truth that not all relationships are meant to survive your evolution. If you're watching this because someone you love keeps reinventing themselves, here's what you need to understand. Their transformation isn't about you. It's not rejection. It's not them running away from the life you built together or the person you've known them to be. When someone reinvents themselves, they're responding to an internal signal you can't hear, a frequency that's calling them towards something truer. The best thing you can do? Stop trying to keep them recognizable. Stop mourning the version of them that felt more comfortable to you, because every time you remind them of who they used to be, you're asking them to perform a self that no longer exists. Instead, get curious. Ask them what they're discovering about themselves, what this transformation means to them, what they're moving toward, not just what they're leaving behind. And here's how to tell if their reinvention is healthy or fear-based. Healthy transformation moves towards something. There's a clarity beneath the chaos. They can articulate, even messily, what they're seeking. Fear-based running is reactive, chaotic, and often accompanied by self-destructive patterns. They're fleeing discomfort rather than following alignment. If someone you love is transforming and it feels authentic, your job isn't to understand every choice. It's to hold space for who they're becoming without demanding they justify it. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is permission to evolve, even when it makes you uncomfortable. But here's what's even more interesting. Studies on identity transformation show that people who reinvent themselves multiple times often report higher life satisfaction than those who maintain rigid consistency. Because each transformation brings them closer to their core self, not further away. The corporate lawyer who becomes a surf instructor isn't running from responsibility. They're running toward a version of themselves that feels true. The party animal who transforms into someone who meditates at dawn isn't rejecting joy. They're discovering a deeper frequency of it. Each reinvention is a layer peeled back, a false self discarded, a truer self emerging. And the people who do this repeatedly, they understand something most people spend their whole lives avoiding, that you can outgrow an identity you once needed, that the person you were at 30 might need to die for the person you are at 40 to live. That transformation isn't failure, it's evolution in real time. Of course, not everyone who reinvents is doing it from a place of clarity. Some are driven by fear, the fear of being truly seen, the fear of commitment, the fear of staying still long enough for the cracks to show. Modern culture has amplified a subtle form of identity anxiety, the constant pressure to curate a self that's impressive, consistent, and legible to others. And for some, that's paralyzing. They worry that if they stay in one place too long, people will see through the performance. So they keep moving, keep transforming, keep starting over. And ironically, sometimes the people who reinvent most frequently are the ones struggling the most with self-acceptance. They're not at peace with who they are. They're searching, hoping the next version will finally feel right. There's a deep truth beneath that restlessness. In a world that constantly says, be consistent, choosing to transform completely becomes a form of self-definition, saying, I exist beyond your need for continuity. I'm allowed to outgrow who I was. even if you love that version. Not every identity you inhabit is meant to last forever. Sometimes the most profound transformations in life happen quietly, privately, without warning. And when you've lived through enough reinventions, you start realizing something crucial. Each version of yourself wasn't a mistake. It was necessary. The corporate climber taught you discipline. The party animal taught you joy. The recluse taught you solitude. Each identity was a chapter, not the whole book. And the people who reinvent themselves understand this instinctively. They don't see their past selves as failures. They see them as necessary evolutions, steps on a path towards something they couldn't name but always sensed. This is where the paradox lives. We're told that knowing yourself means finding one true identity and staying there. Yet sometimes, knowing yourself means recognizing when an identity has run its course. When the version of you that served you at 25 is suffocating you at 35. When you reinvent yourself, you stop chasing understood transformations and start trusting necessary ones. You begin noticing which relationships were built on who you appeared to be versus who you actually are. That kind of clarity, raw and unsettling, feels heavier and infinitely more honest. And the people who transform repeatedly, they live in that clarity. They make decisions that don't need applause. They honor endings without turning them into content. And they let entire identities die without needing to justify why. Part of this is about what psychologists call self-authorship, the ability to define your own identity rather than accepting the definitions others impose. When you're grounded in that kind of internal authority, you don't need others to validate your transformations. That's not arrogance. That's freedom. And ironically, the same people who reinvent themselves often have the richest inner lives. They've lived multiple versions of existence. They've been the ambitious one, the quiet one, the social one, the isolated one. They contain multitudes because they've allowed themselves to be multitudes. But they save their full complexity for the few who can hold it, not for everyone who demands they stay recognizable. Because real integrity to them isn't measured in consistency or loyalty to one path. It's in being honest enough to transform when staying the same would be a performance. These are the people who trust their evolution deeply, who process constantly, who understand that sometimes growth means becoming unrecognizable to people who love the old version. They don't need the world to understand their transformations. They just need to honor them. And maybe, just maybe, in a world so desperate for consistency, their willingness to shed entire selves isn't weakness, it's wisdom. A reminder that not every identity is meant to last a lifetime. That sometimes the most authentic thing you can do is let who you were die so who you're becoming can live. You know what's fascinating? The longer someone stays transformed, the more clarity replaces confusion. In the beginning, reinvention feels disorienting. There's guilt, anxiety, fear that you've made a terrible mistake, fear that you'll wake up one day and regret burning down everything you built. But over time, something changes. The noise quiets, the expectations fade, and what's left is just you. The version you couldn't access while performing the old identity. Distance becomes clarity, transformation becomes truth. The death of who you were becomes the birth of who you are. It's as if shedding everything that didn't fit allows you to finally inhabit what does. Because when you're no longer maintaining an identity for others, you start living from your center instead of your edges. There's a quiet beauty in existing without needing to make sense to everyone. You're not defending your evolution. You're not justifying your transformation. You're just there, fully committed to the life you're building in the aftermath of who you used to be. And that's something performed consistency rarely allows. But the psychology behind this goes deeper than preference. It's rooted in how we process self-worth. Every time we maintain an identity for external approval, we're unconsciously asking for permission. We're saying, is it okay that I'm this person? Do you agree this version of me is acceptable? Over time, we begin to crave that validation. We start thinking our transformations only matter if others comprehend them. That our evolution only counts if people who knew us before can track the journey and say, yes, this makes sense. Now, imagine someone who resists that loop. Someone who deliberately chooses to transform without consensus. who become someone new without needing anyone's blessing. That's not detachment. That's self-authority. It takes profound self-awareness to reinvent yourself without needing anyone to understand why. People who do this often have what psychologists call an internal locus of identity. Their sense of who they are comes from within, not from external recognition. They don't need others to validate their transformations to believe they made the right choice. And here's what's even more interesting. Research on identity transformation shows that people who process change privately often experience less prolonged identity crisis than those who seek external validation at every stage. Because when your sense of self is internal, it becomes solid. It becomes real. You're no longer waiting for someone else to grant you permission to become who you're becoming. You're living in the truth you've already accepted. And maybe that's the real freedom. Staying whole in a world that demands you fragment yourself for everyone else's comfort. Of course, transformation doesn't always mean serenity. Sometimes it hides exhaustion. For many, their old identity became a space where they once found belonging but ended up feeling trapped. There's a subtle suffocation that comes from performing a self that stopped being true months or years ago, from defending a version of yourself that you've already outgrown. You start questioning your own knowing. You start wondering if you're wrong to want something different, even when every cell in your body is screaming for change. And eventually, some people decide to transform. Not out of anger or rebellion, but out of self-preservation. They realize they don't owe the world a performance of who they used to be. They don't owe an explanation for evolving. And they don't need to keep proving they're making the right choice by becoming someone new. That's one of the quiet truths of modern identity. We've confused consistency with integrity. We assume that to be trustworthy, you must stay the same. But real integrity sometimes looks like trusting that your transformation is necessary, that who you're becoming doesn't need a defense, that you can honor what was without pretending it still fits. And maybe that's what those who reinvent themselves understand best. They know that growth is personal. It's something you give yourself, not something you extract from others' approval. Because when you stop waiting for someone to grant you permission to evolve, you start living in the integrity of your own becoming. You stop announcing every transformation. You start simply living them. That's something profoundly rare in a culture addicted to consistent personal brands. So the next time someone reinvents themselves completely, don't assume they're lost. Don't assume they're running from commitment or afraid of depth. Maybe they're not confused. Maybe they're the most clear they've ever been. Maybe they're not running away. Maybe they're running toward a version of themselves they finally have the courage to become. Maybe they're not unstable. Maybe they're just unwilling to calcify into an identity that stopped fitting. And maybe, just maybe, their willingness to shed entire selves isn't chaos, it's clarity. The quiet, courageous act of choosing evolution over consistency, truth over performance, becoming over being. Because in the end, we're not meant to stay the same just because others are comfortable with who we were. We're not meant to perform continuity for people who confuse consistency with integrity. We're not meant to stay in identities that no longer fit simply because transformation makes others uncomfortable. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is reinvent yourself. Not because you're avoiding who you were, but because you're finally honoring who you're becoming. And the people who do this, who shed entire selves without apology, they remind us of something crucial. That identity isn't a destination you arrive at once. That some people need to live multiple lives within one lifetime. That transformation isn't failure. Sometimes becoming unrecognizable is the only way to become real.